What if I told you there was an African god who was worshipped for centuries, revered by entire kingdoms, invoked in sacred rituals, and who was deliberately erased from the Holy Scriptures? It seems impossible, doesn't it? But the truth is, there's more hidden in the history of spirituality than you ever imagined. What I'm about to reveal here may shock you, challenge your deepest beliefs, and transform the way you view God, the Bible, and African spirituality. Few people dare to talk about this. Few have the courage to question what has been taught, repeated, and indoctrinated for centuries. But today, you will have access to a truth that has been hidden in the shadows of official religion, a truth that can explain the spiritual emptiness many feel, and why. Most of the world believes that the history of faith begins in the Middle East, passes through Europe, and then spreads throughout the world. But what about Africa? Does everything that comes from Africa boil down to idolatry and paganism, as we've been so often taught? Or was there a systematic attempt to erase African divinity from humanity's collective memory? Get ready, because this video is unlike anything you've ever seen. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not guesswork. It's revelation. It's denunciation. It's rescue. A spiritual, ancestral, and profound rescue. We're talking about a God who predates many known records, who was worshipped as the supreme creator in ancient African cultures, and who, at some point in history, was silenced, hidden, replaced, and not by chance. This erasure stems from religious, colonial, and political interests. This God's name was rewritten, his attributes were appropriated, his stories were modified, and whoever dared remember was silenced. We're not just talking about religious censorship. We're talking about spiritual theft, a clear attempt to disconnect a people from their own divine essence. You may be asking yourself, but why would they do that? Because whoever controls the image of God controls people's faith, and whoever controls faith controls everything. Over the centuries, sacred texts underwent translations, editions, and editorial choices that favored certain empires and dominant religions. And in this process, many elements linked to African spirituality were removed, distorted, or demonized. But the traces are still there, in names, symbols, genealogies, and forgotten passages. You just have to know where to look. In this video, we'll reveal the name of this erased African god. We'll explore his characteristics, his connection to scripture, and the reasons behind his disappearance. You'll understand how this exclusion shaped the spiritual outlook of the modern world, and why it's so important to recognize this truth now. If you're someone seeking answers, someone who feels like there are missing pieces in the puzzle of faith, you're in the right place. This video isn't just information, it's reconnection, it's revelation, it's a call to truth. Many will resist this message. Others will feel liberated, but no one will emerge unscathed. So stay with me until the end, because in the next few minutes we'll begin to lift the veil that covers God's forgotten face. We'll expose the truth that has been hidden for generations, and with each passing minute, you'll understand why this story was silenced, and why it now needs to be told. Now that you're about to learn the origin and signs of this erased God, the question remains, why exactly was he removed, and who benefited from it? This is the next part of our investigation, and the answer could change everything you believe, and the answer could change everything you believe. But before we move on to this revelation, I need to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this so far? Have you ever suspected that parts of the truth have been erased from the Bible? That perhaps there are African roots of spirituality that you've never been told about? Leave your comment below. Don't be silent. Your voice is also part of this rescue. When you comment, you strengthen the algorithm, yes, but most importantly, you strengthen this movement of spiritual awareness that is awakening around the world. Your comment may even inspire others to question, reflect, and awaken as well. And if this content resonates with you, click the like button right now. This isn't just a gesture, it's a way to show YouTube that this topic is important, that it deserves to be seen, recommended, and shared. Your like is a seed that spreads this knowledge. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because what you're seeing here is just the beginning. This video is part of a series of in-depth investigations into spiritual mysteries, hidden truths, and revelations that have been forbidden for centuries. Hit the bell so you don't miss a thing. The next videos will take you even deeper into this journey. Now then, let's continue, because what follows will show you how history was written and rewritten to conceal the divine presence in Africa. Now that your eyes are open to what was hidden for centuries, we need to go back in time. We need to reconstruct the path that led us to this erasure. And to do so, it's essential to understand the historical and geographical context of African spirituality before colonization. A living, organic, cosmic spirituality. A spirituality connected to the elements, to the cycles of nature, to the stars, and to universal spiritual laws that didn't depend on stone temples, but rather on consciousness. Long before any European Christian influence reached the African continent, a profound understanding of divine existence already existed. Entire peoples recognized the existence of a supreme God, creator of all things, who manifested himself in multiple forms and dimensions, reflected in creation itself. We are not talking about polytheism in the simplistic sense they taught, but rather a complex worldview where the sacred was present in everything, from the grain of sand to the most distant constellation. African spirituality was so sophisticated that many of its symbols, prayers, astrological charts, and spiritual codes influenced other cultures, but were reinterpreted, appropriated, and subsequently delegitimized. Civilizations such as Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush, Axum, Dahomey, Mali, and Kemet, the original name of what we now call Egypt, carried within their foundations the presence of this supreme God, often identified as the invisible God, inaccessible to the human ego, but revealed to the pure of heart and those connected to their ancestry. We are experiencing an extremely difficult era in which the prophecies are being scored, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. This is why I made my digital book available to reveal the apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time. Click now and make sure your digital copy. In Nubia, for example, we find clear evidence of an ancestral theology centered on a single creator, a divine principle that stands above all other spiritual beings. This creator was associated with light, order, the breath of life, the eternal river that flows within every human being. He was not only worshipped, he was respected as part of a people's very identity. In Kush, their temples spoke of a God who needed no image because his image was in the heart of the righteous. And in Axum, in what is now Ethiopia, this divine conception permeated the people's politics, culture, and spiritual science. All of this may seem distant to those who learned spirituality through the Roman or European filter, where the sacred was often transformed into an instrument of control. But when we look at ancient texts, including apocryphal texts, we realize a gap, a deliberate gap. There are characters, references, lineages, and places mentioned briefly, and then silenced. Have you ever noticed how many times Ethiopia, for example, is mentioned in the Bible? And why is it always associated with power, glory, wisdom, and divine presence? This same Ethiopia that, in Ethiopian tradition, claims to have guarded the Ark of the Covenant. This same land that speaks of a God who needed no intermediaries, who communicated directly with his sons and daughters through dreams, signs, and nature itself. Could this be why this divine presence needed to be erased? The evidence is everywhere, from archaeological records showing spiritual structures aligned with the stars, to oral traditions passed down from generation to generation, protected by elders who knew that one day this truth would resurface. There are scrolls, inscriptions, symbols, and even fragments of texts that speak of a God whose name has been replaced, his stories rewritten, his culture transformed into legend, and his image relegated to obscurity by colonial religious interests. And don't forget to get your digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. And why does this matter today? Because when we disconnect from a people's original spirituality, we create a chasm between their being and their essence. African spirituality was demonized, not because it was false, but because it was powerful, because it was free, because it did not submit to structures of religious domination, nor depend on mediation to exist. It was a spirituality that liberated, not imprisoned. and that is precisely why it had to be silenced. It was too dangerous for the empires of the time. But most disturbing of all is that this spirituality still resonates. It is still alive. It pulses in the blood of millions of people who feel something is missing from the faith they were taught. People who realize there is a void, a spiritual silence that cries out for answers. And perhaps, just perhaps, that answer lies precisely in what has been forgotten: the African God, the erased Creator. And if you think this is all coincidence, consider this. Why were so many African names removed from biblical genealogies? Why were so many African descendant characters whitewashed in translations and artistic representations? Why were so many books dealing with the origins of humanity and the divine presence in Africa classified as uninspired or heretical? Did those who wrote the official history of spirituality really want you to know the whole truth? This question, my friend, is uncomfortable, but necessary. And in this video, we're here for precisely that, to provoke discomfort in order to raise awareness. Because as long as we accept everything we've been taught without question, we will remain trapped in a version of faith that was shaped to keep us submissive, separated from our origins, and far from the true essence of God. What if I told you that there are texts, records, and stories that indicate that this African God was not only real, but that he directly influenced the construction of the idea of God as we know it today? What if I showed you that this God had a name, a voice, a symbol, and that all of this was deliberately erased so that a new religious system could be established without resistance? Perhaps now you'll begin to understand why this revelation is so disturbing, why it was buried so deeply. But the soil of truth always sprouts, sooner or later. And today, it's sprouting within you. Comment below about your feelings so far. Had you ever considered this possibility before? Do you think some African spirituality was actually censored? Or were you already familiar with any tradition that spoke of an African creator God? Tell me in the comments, "I feel like I'm awakening," or "I want to know more about this African creator God." Each comment from you strengthens this journey and shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people. But now that we're beginning to understand how African spirituality was systematically stifled, an inevitable question remains. The question that's been pulsing in the hearts of everyone watching this far. Who was this African God who was erased from the Holy Scriptures? What name did he have? What attributes did he carry? And why was his memory considered so dangerous that it was silenced for centuries? To begin to answer this, we need to clear space in our minds and spirits. We need to free ourselves from the stereotypical images of divinity that have been imposed and return to the source, the root, the original breath of faith that sprang from the African land. Because this God, unlike what many imagine, was not a tribal spirit limited to a specific people. He was universal. He was the supreme creator, the divine principle that precedes form, dogma, or doctrine. He was the one who was present before time, before matter, before language. In the traditions preserved orally by ancient peoples, this God is often called Olodumare, or Nzambi, or Amma, different names but conveying the same concept. The absolute God, invisible, bodiless, yet present in everything. A God who could not be represented by any image because his essence was beyond human comprehension, yet accessible through true spiritual connection. He was not a distant God. He was a God who inhabits breath, wind, water, thunder, seed, and consciousness. He was understood as the source of the entire cycle of life, creator of heaven and earth, maintainer of the balance between the elements, and guardian of the invisible laws governing the spiritual universe. In the African worldview, he needed neither luxurious priests nor marble temples. He inhabited the body of those who lived in harmony with creation. His home was the heart of the righteous, and his altar, the deep connection with ancestors, the cycles of nature, and the spiritual wisdom revealed in every detail of life. This God was not a God of war, of punishment, or of fear, like the gods imposed by many later religious systems. He was balance, life, justice, love, and spiritual order. He was both the center and the periphery, the invisible that sustained the visible. In some cultures, his name was not even spoken frequently, as it was believed to carry direct creative power. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that this description bears a disconcerting resemblance to how the biblical God is described between the lines of the earliest scriptures, especially in texts that were left out of the final version of the Bible we know today. In apocryphal texts, in Gnostic writings, in the oldest Jewish traditions, there are references to a God who dwells in the inaccessible light, who cannot be represented, who breathes the Spirit directly into human beings, a concept that resonates deeply with original African spirituality. In fact, there are passages where the biblical God is associated with the wind that hovered over the waters, the breath of life, the voice from the burning bush, deeply symbolic images that directly evoke the natural elements central to ancient African theology. This makes us reflect. Was the God of Africa actually the first concept of a true God, and not an isolated invention? Did Hebrew traditions absorb, consciously or unconsciously, aspects of this African creator God? The answer seems to be revealed in history's deliberate silence. Because as African civilizations were colonized, the names of these supreme gods were replaced by generic words or even demonized images. What was once considered sacred came to be classified as superstition or witchcraft. And so, the creator God, who refused to be confined to stone walls or human words, was forgotten, or rather, erased. But his attributes survived. His love of justice, his balance with nature, his reverence for his ancestors, his awareness that the spiritual world is present in everything. All of this has survived as a living spiritual memory, pulsing through the veins of those who still sense something greater, deeper, and more ancient than what the books have told. This African God not only created but also organized the universe in perfect rhythm. It was believed that every human being was born with a spark of him, a mission, a destiny, a spiritual purpose to be fulfilled. He was not a God of cold rules, but of natural order. He did not punish out of caprice, but corrected through balance. He did not need fear to be worshipped. He was revered because his presence could be felt in everything. In the morning breeze, in the song of a bird, in the smell of wet earth, in the silence of dawn, this God spoke to those who knew how to listen. When we begin to rebuild this image, something within us awakens. There's an intimate, almost genetic recognition, an echo in the soul saying, "You've met this God before." Perhaps that's why so many people, when watching content like this, say in the comments that they feel something strange, profound, a kind of inner calling, because this God hasn't been lost. He's been silenced, but not destroyed. He's being remembered now, through each one who dares to seek beyond what they've been taught. Maybe that's why you're here, not by chance, but by destiny, because something in you wants to reconnect with this original source of spirituality. Because you sense, even if you can't explain it, that there's something beyond institutionalized faith. There's a spiritual memory that was buried, but is now resurfacing. And this God is the key. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt this presence that doesn't fit within religion? Have you ever had dreams, visions, or just deep feelings that there's something more ancient and true within you? Right here, I feel the calling, or this God speaks to me. Your answer will not only feed the algorithm, it will strengthen this community of seekers that is emerging around this channel, because together we can remember what the world tried to erase. You might even wonder, is all this just a spiritual theory? A symbolic construct that lives only in the realm of ideas or ancestral faith? But no, what you're hearing here goes beyond the subjective realm, because this African God, forgotten and erased from the official records of faith, left traces. He left evidence, visible marks in history, culture, archaeology, and the memory of people who refuse to forget. There are temples, sculptures, inscriptions, and sacred objects that reveal that this spirituality not only existed, it was central to the fabric of diverse African civilizations. Traces of these records are still buried in the Sahel, on the banks of the Nile, in the heart of Ethiopia, on the sacred soil of Nigeria, and in parts of Sudan where modern borders obscure the boundaries of ancient kingdoms that knew this God by names you may never have heard, but which carry spiritual power to this day. For example, there are reliefs carved into stones, geometric figures associated with the elements of creation, symbols of the balance between heaven and earth, representations of the spirit as an infinite spiral, symbols that were not intended to represent lesser gods, but rather the creator God himself in his cosmic manifestations. In some of these archaeological sites, scholars have found ritual chambers aligned with constellations, the position of the sun at the solstice, or specific lunar phases, not as a form of worship to the stars, but as a way of recognizing the divine order inscribed in the universe itself. Creation as a reflection of the Creator. These records, for the most part, were not made with ink or paper. They were carved in stone, clay, bronze, and even in ritual silence. And what makes it all the more impressive is that, even after centuries of spiritual colonization, many of these traditions still endure. In the villages, in ceremonies, in words spoken in whispers by elders who know they can't share everything with just anyone, but who rejoice when they find ready ears. Ancient historians also left clues. Arab chroniclers, Greek travelers, Roman explorers, and Jewish sages cited in their accounts the presence of peoples who worshipped a single, invisible God who could not be physically represented, a creator of all, to whom men addressed themselves in silence or through ceremonial chants. Some of these records have come down to us in distorted form, translated through biased lenses by copyists who did not understand, or did not want to understand, what they were truly reading. But even so, the essence remains, and perhaps one of the most important sources confirming this divine presence is precisely oral tradition. While written records were burned, documents destroyed, and sacred symbols looted, the people preserved their memories through speech, dance, music, and stories told around the fire. Knowledge was passed down by word of mouth, from generation to generation, like a secret held in the collective heart of a civilization. In many places, this god continued to be invoked, even if under different names, even if camouflaged under the guise of new religious systems. He never completely disappeared. He simply hid behind the curtains of spiritual resistance. There are ancient proverbs that say, "When the written word breaks, the voice of the old rises." And that is exactly what happened. The stories told by elderly women in the villages, the tales passed down by griots, the rhythmic chants in rituals, all carry an invisible thread that connects us directly to this erased creator. And the most astonishing thing is that, even in places where Christianity and Islam became dominant, this memory of the original God remained alive, often mixed, syncretized, adapted, but alive. You can find this spiritual presence in the creation myths told in West Africa, in the sacred ceremonies of the Yoruba people, in the wisdom preserved in Axum, in the prayers of the Saharan shepherds, and even in the cultural traces that crossed the Atlantic along with enslaved bodies, and today echo in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Because yes, this God was carried in memory, even when his names were forgotten, the soul remembered. And the most impressive thing is that, with the advancement of archaeological and anthropological sciences, many of these elements are being rediscovered. Ancient altars are unearthed, forgotten scriptures reappear, and each find is another piece of the puzzle that confirms there was indeed a systematic attempt to erase this spirituality. But the truth, no matter how hard they try to bury it, always resurfaces. You can even see this in the reactions of those who hear these teachings for the first time. Many people report a feeling that isn't surprise but recognition, as if something inside them says, "I always knew something existed before I was taught." This isn't coincidence. It's spiritual memory. It's proof that the spirit knows, even when the mind has been indoctrinated to forget. There's a powerful force connecting it all, a call that spans time, that can't be erased or replaced, an energy that speaks to those ready to listen. And now, by bringing this historical and cultural evidence to light, we're only at the beginning of this journey. Because what comes next is even more disturbing: the evidence of intentional erasure, the political and religious decisions that caused this God's name to disappear from official records. But before we move on, I want to hear from you. Comment below. Were you already familiar with any of these traditions? Have you heard of Olodumare, Ama, or Nzambi? Or perhaps you felt at some point in your life that an ancestral wisdom was wanting to emerge within you? Write in the comments, "I am part of this living memory," or "The voice of the ancestors still echoes within me." Each comment from you strengthens this spiritual current and shows YouTube that this video needs to reach more people. Now that we know who this ancestral God was, present at the roots of African spirituality, and we've begun to glimpse the traces he left in history and culture, It's time to enter the most sensitive territory of all, the Scriptures. Because yes, no matter how much we try to deny it, there are traces of him in the Bible itself. But to see them, one must read with spiritual eyes, eyes that are not content with the literal text, but delve deeper, seeking what was left between the lines, in the silences, in the metaphors, in the changed names, in the altered codes, in the deleted chapters. The truth is that the Bible as we know it today underwent a long process of construction, selection, and editing. Over centuries, human decisions, political, religious, and strategic, shaped what would be considered inspired and what would be dismissed as heresy. And in this process, many uncomfortable truths were left out, including those that directly linked the divine presence to Africa and peoples of African descent. Let's take a closer look. How many times have you read or heard that Moses was educated in Egypt, that Joseph married an Egyptian woman, that Solomon had affairs with women from other nations, including Ethiopians, that Jesus himself, as a baby, was taken to Egypt, not as an exile, but as someone protected on African soil? Why are these connections always there, but never explored in depth in pulpits, sermons, and official scholarship? Because deepening these connections would require recognizing that the African presence in the Bible is not peripheral, it is central, and that behind these encounters with Africa, a spiritual link is being revealed, a link with a God who was already worshipped before the arrival of Hebrew monotheism, but who was there, silently present, behind the scenes of the texts. In some passages of the Old Testament, we find references to the Most High God, the God creator of heaven and earth, who appears before the revelation of the name YHWH. This God is recognized by figures such as Melchizedek, a priest of an order without genealogy, without father, without mother, without beginning of days, a profoundly mysterious figure, revered by Abraham. But where did this Melchizedek come from? What God did he represent? Ethiopian tradition suggests that he originated in the region of ancient African Jerusalem, even before the Hebrew conquest. And this version, if accepted, completely changes the origin of monotheistic worship. There are also mentions of the land of Cush and Sheba, where kings prostrate themselves before the God of Israel. But the text doesn't explain why these African kings would recognize this God if he were in fact unknown to them. The most logical conclusion would be that this God was already known, but under different names, with different symbols, with different manifestations. In the book of Isaiah, for example, the prophet says that Ethiopia will stretch out her hands to God, and that from the land of Cush will come those who will bring gifts to the Lord. Doesn't it seem strange that even in the prophecies of restoration, Africa appears as a source of reverence for the divine? Something doesn't add up with the narrative that Africans were pagan peoples without spiritual light. And this only reinforces what we've been saying. There is a veiled presence of the African God in the Scriptures, a hidden presence, but not erased. And when we examine the Psalms, Proverbs, and Songs of Wisdom, we find symbolic language associated with nature. Rivers, mountains, winds, trees, rain, thunder. These elements in African spirituality represent direct manifestations of the Creator's presence. Were these psalms influenced by earlier traditions? Did the way of praising, singing, and connecting with God already exist in African cultures long before they were transcribed into Hebrew? More than that, some words were translated and adapted with clear intentions. The word Cush, for example, is often replaced by Ethiopia in modern translations, which already distances the term from its true origin. In other passages, terms that would indicate African peoples were replaced by neutral or Europeanized names. And in books considered apocryphal, such as Enoch, which was preserved for millennia only by Ethiopian tradition, there are celestial descriptions and references to spiritual beings who carry wisdom very similar to that found in ancient African myths. Coincidence or concealment? This same book of Enoch and others like the book of Jubilees speak of the lineages of Noah's sons, of the division of the earth, of peoples blessed by God who were later forgotten. And, curiously, many of these peoples were located in Africa. But this kind of reading doesn't reach most people, because the texts were cut, hidden, discredited, labeled non-canonical. And the question you need to ask now is, who decided this? And with what intention? It's impossible to ignore that most biblical characters who interacted with African peoples did so in contexts of alliance, respect, marriage, or learning. Moses was saved by an African woman. The Cushite woman mentioned in Numbers was the target of jealousy and prejudice from Miriam. And what was God's response? He defended Moses and punished Miriam. Why? Because prejudice against African women had no place in God's eyes. When we connect the dots, we realize that the presence of the African God in Scripture has been silenced, but not entirely removed. There are cracks in the text, traces that escaped censorship, codes that can only be deciphered by those who are spiritually awakened. And perhaps now, as you listen to all this, you feel that sacred unease, the sensation that something is being revealed, not just to your intellect, but to your soul. And it's precisely this feeling that needs to be shared. So, I want to ask you, comment below, write "I'm beginning to see," or "The Bible has more than I've been told." If something here touched you, your interaction is more than important. It's part of the spiritual resistance. And if you feel this video is bringing you answers you've always sought, leave a like now. This click is like a drumbeat echoing in the digital world, calling more people to awaken. If the African God was there, hidden in symbols, echoes of biblical passages, and revered in cultures that predate the records of Scripture we have today, then the inevitable question arises, why was he erased? What kind of force or intention could silence the presence of a living, pulsating creator God? Connected to the elements, who was the spiritual reference for entire civilizations? The answer isn't just faith, it's history, politics, dominion, and, above all, fear. Yes, fear has always been behind the great erasures. Fear of awakening, fear of spiritual freedom, fear of a people who connected directly with the divine without needing intermediaries. Because this was the essence of African spirituality: direct, living, organic, intuitive. A people who listened to the signs of nature, who danced with the cycles of creation, who conversed with God through fire, water, and the sound of the drum. A people who did not kneel by imposition, but revered through connection. And this was too dangerous for the power structures that emerged with colonial empires and institutionalized religious systems. Erasure began with colonization, not just of bodies, but also of souls. European empires knew that to completely dominate a people, they had to sever the spiritual bond that connected them to their roots. And this was done not just with swords or guns, but with doctrine, with manufactured theology, with forced biblical interpretations, with councils where men, and only men, decided what was sacred and what would be dismissed as heresy. During these councils, like that of Nicaea and so many others that followed in the following centuries, books were banned, passages rewritten, names changed, origins adulterated. Faith was standardized, and everything that smacked of ancestry, of connection to the land, of free spirituality, was labeled pagan. It was demonized. And in many cases, what was simply African became automatically considered evil, not because it was, but because it had to be seen that way for the new system to sustain itself. The African God didn't fit into the new narrative. He didn't fit into the logic of guilt, punishment, or fear. He was balance, ancestry, and freedom. He was feminine and masculine. He was wind and fire. He was whisper and thunder. And above all, he didn't depend on temples, religious hierarchies, or dogma. This made him incompatible with the project of global domination that would weaponize faith. So what did they do? First, they silenced him in words. Then, they hid him in texts. They erased his names, altered his genealogies, and replaced symbols. And when that wasn't enough, they persecuted his followers, burned his rituals, converted by the sword, and indoctrinated by the cross. The European theologians who rewrote the foundations of the Christian faith knew exactly what they were doing. They had access to ancient manuscripts, oral traditions, and documents that have now been lost or hidden. And yet, they chose to reconfigure the image of God in a way that served the interests of European power, a God who justified conquest, submission, slavery, and colonization. A white God with a European face, with a stern and distant gaze. But the question that screams within those who awaken is, where is the God of my people? Where is the Creator who spoke through the ancestors, who taught with the rhythms of nature, who inhabited the earth before any scripture was written? The answer is simple and brutal. He was hidden, because his presence threatened the foundations of lies. And more than that, African spirituality has always been holistic, communal, based on a balance between the visible and invisible worlds. It didn't separate body from spirit. It didn't separate the divine from the everyday. Everything was sacred. The land was sacred. The water was sacred. Memory was sacred. Dance was sacred. Ancestry was sacred. And when you live in such a system, no one controls anyone else. Because everyone is a temple. Everyone is a priest. Everyone carries the divine spark. Systems of domination needed to break this structure. They needed to create a new spiritual language, one where few interpret and many obey, where faith is vertical, authoritarian, and laden with guilt and fear. And to do so, they needed to erase the old language, the language of the drum, of the breath, of the gaze that spans generations, of the dream that brings messages, of the silence that reveals. But like all violent erasures, this one also left cracks. And it is through these cracks that the truth is now beginning to emerge again. Because what is imprinted on the soul of a people cannot be erased. And the God they tried to hide lives on in the stories told by grandmothers, in the beating of drums, in the ancient names that survive in the songs, in the syncretic practices that carry, even when mixed, the essence of a knowledge much older than Europe ever understood. Therefore, the erasure was strategic. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was planned. And it was perpetuated for centuries with the help of religious missions, manipulated translations, forced catechesis, and the destruction of original spiritual practices. But what they didn't know is that each generation carries seeds of what came before. And now those seeds are sprouting. You who are listening to all this, perhaps you are feeling this bud blossom within you. Perhaps you are beginning to remember, not with your mind, but with your spirit. Because awakening is not a lesson, it is a reunion. And this reunion is happening now. That's why I want you to write here in the comments, "I see beyond the story told," or "The God of my people is returning." Your words are not just meant to engage this video. They are spiritual affirmations, declarations of resistance, seeds of truth. As we open our eyes to what has been erased, we begin to see the traces that have survived. Because even in the face of centuries of persecution, censorship, and distortion, the truth about this African God, the original creator revered before theological and colonial interference, has not completely disappeared. It has survived in forms that not even empires have been able to destroy. It is hidden in the soils that hold ancient secrets, in the words of ancient travelers who saw it with their own eyes, and in the mouths of the elders who, even in silence, carried the story in their souls. Let's begin with the material remains, the archaeological evidence that can no longer be denied, even though it's often ignored. Artifacts scattered across the African continent point to a complex, profound, and ancient theology. Ceremonial altars built in regions like Nubia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Benin demonstrate a reverence for a divine principle that was not fragmented, but rather one and absolute. Megalithic alignments with the movement of the stars and the sun, stones carved with symbols representing balance, fertility, creation, and order, all point to an understanding of God as the architect of the universe, present in everything, yet above all. Excavations in areas around the Nile have revealed not only worship structures, but also ancient scriptures describing the God of the beginning, the creator who needed no image, for his essence was beyond form, a God who was time itself, the word itself, the very cycle of life. These texts, even damaged by time or deliberately destroyed by colonizers, still bear traces of what so many have tried to erase. And the most surprising thing is that these records coincide with what has been preserved orally by African peoples to this day. Now think with me. How can different peoples, separated by thousands of kilometers, describe a creator with the same attributes? How can such distinct cultures share the same reverence for the invisible that inhabits the visible? The answer lies in what many call collective spiritual memory, a knowledge that was sown before writing, before paper, before ink. A knowledge planted in the heart of humanity, and that flourished primarily on the African continent. And it's not just archaeology that confirms this. The accounts of ancient historians also shed light on this forgotten truth. Egyptian, Ethiopian, Greek, and even Arab chroniclers who traveled to regions of Africa recounted with admiration the rituals of worship of a supreme God. A God who communicated not through statues but through signs, dreams, the beating of the earth, and synchronicities of the universe. A God who was celebrated with dance, drums, fasting, sacred words, and silence. Yes, silence was also a form of prayer, for the people knew that the divine speaks when the ego is silent. Diodorus Siculus, Herodotus, and other ancient historians made reference to the Nubian and Kushite people's worship of an invisible god. A god they claimed was more ancient than even the Egyptian gods. But note, these accounts were later discredited or marginalized by European scholars. Why? Because admitting them as truth would mean acknowledging the spiritual depth of a people intentionally portrayed as primitive. And even if they burned scrolls, looted temples, and rewrote narratives, they couldn't erase oral heritage. This is where we enter the most powerful territory of all, oral traditions. The voice of ancestors who did not bow, who did not forget, who kept the Creator's name even when forced to kneel before other gods. Entire peoples who, from generation to generation, kept alive the flame of a God who did not abandon his creation, even when his image was erased. There are chants sung in ancient languages that speak of Nzambi, Olodumare, Amma, Nyame, different names for the same creative force that inhabits the invisible. These chants have traversed centuries, oceans, wars, slavery, and colonization, and still echo in toreros, in Afro-diasporic cults, in prayers whispered by mothers of saints, and in the advice whispered in the ear by a grandfather in a village. Oral memory is perhaps the most indestructible of sacred archives. Have you ever wondered why, even after so much spiritual oppression, the drums keep beating? Why have certain rites never stopped being performed, even in secret? Why does a wisdom survive where the Bible was denied, where the gospel was violently imposed? Because this wisdom predates the oppression. It is the spiritual response to all attempts at erasure. And the most moving thing is that today, with the help of modern archaeology, anthropological research, and the opening of consciousness, these traditions are finally being recognized, not as folklore, but as legitimate, rich, ancient theology, carrying a divine understanding that the West is still beginning to grasp. Every drum, every symbol, every rite of passage, every ancestral proverb is living proof that the African God was never forgotten, only silenced. But now, the voices that were silenced are returning. They are speaking through videos like this, through young people investigating their roots, through scholars who have the courage to question official history, and above all, through ordinary people who are awakening. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you resonates with this truth. Something inside you recognizes that there's more, much more, than what you've been taught. And that's why this conversation can't stop here. It needs to grow, spread, and strengthen. So comment below, I am living proof of ancestral memory, or the voice of my ancestors still speaks within me. You can even write something personal, a brief account, an intuition you had while watching this video. What matters is that you don't remain silent, because each comment here is more than engagement. It is the continuation of a tradition that refuses to die. When a god is erased, it's not just a name, it's a memory, a bond, a reflection of identity. And when this happens, the consequences span time and generations. It's as if an entire people were disconnected from their deepest roots, from their most ancient spiritual history, from their own reflection in the divine. This is exactly what happened to African and Afro-descendant peoples throughout the centuries. The erasure of the African god was not just a theological maneuver. It was a psychological, spiritual, cultural, and existential blow that affected millions of souls. When European colonizers arrived on African soil, they didn't just bring weapons and ships. They also brought a ready-made faith structure, molded according to imperial conveniences, with a strange, white-faced, distant, and severe god, shrouded in unfamiliar rituals and a language completely alien to the hearts of those people. It wasn't just about introducing a new religion. It was about replacing what already existed, disconnecting the people from their deities, their ancestors, and their sacred spiritual codes. Forced Christianization was not an invitation to conversion. It was an imposition. Missionaries marched side by side with soldiers. Where the new god was not accepted, there was punishment. There were floggings. There were burnings of symbols. There were invasions of toreros, destruction of drums, arrests of priests and spiritual mothers. Everything that connected these people to their original creator was treated as superstition, witchcraft, sin, or idolatry. It didn't matter if this connection had sustained entire communities for millennia. It was enough to not be within the new book, and it was automatically demonized. And here begins one of the cruelest aspects of this erasure: the demonization of what was sacred. Rituals that celebrated fertility, life, and the passage of natural cycles were distorted as devil worship. Ancestral spiritual entities, which functioned as messengers of the Creator, as balancing forces, as symbols of divine nature itself, were reduced to evil spirits. What was once wisdom became heresy. What was spirituality became witchcraft. And so, millions of people began to reject themselves, their names, their rights, their language, their color, their origins. The wound deepened when, in the Americas, this same process was intensified by the transatlantic slave trade. Men and women torn from their lands were forbidden to practice their beliefs. They were forcibly baptized. Their names were changed. Their orishas and inkesis were hidden behind Catholic saints. And worst of all, they were taught to be ashamed of themselves, to look at their own reflection and see sin, to believe that their original faith was wrong, dirty, impure. This not only stole faith, it stole spiritual self-esteem. A people who worshiped the God who created everything were taught that they would only be accepted if they bowed to the God of the oppressor. And here lies the key to the most profound impact: the disconnection from their own inner divinity. When a people lose the right to recognize God with their own eyes, with their own language, with their own skin, they begin to see themselves as inferior. They begin to believe they need to be saved by others. They begin to accept oppression as sacred. This is the darkest point of erasure. It doesn't just remove the divine, it inserts self-hatred. The consequences of this are still visible today. How many times have you heard someone say that the drum is from the devil, that African rites are dangerous, that ancestor worship is a sin? How many black men and women grew up believing that their original faith was cursed, and that only through European culture could they be purified? How many still today frequent religious spaces where their own origins are scorned or erased? The impact wasn't just religious. It was cultural, it was psychological, it was symbolic. It shaped the way we see ourselves, how we understand spirituality, how we build our families, our values, our dreams. It taught us to doubt our strength, to distrust our intuition, to fear our connection with nature, to reject our own traits, our own names, our own saints, our own rhythms. And even when syncretism emerged as a form of resistance, it was still tainted by shame. It was necessary to hide, to codify, to change names, to worship underground, behind the scenes, in the wee hours of the morning, in the alleys. The African god became a whisper, became a code, became silence. But even so, he resisted. Because even erased from official history, he never stopped pulsating in the souls of those who refused to forget. And the saddest thing is that erasure created a cycle, a spiritual chain. People who were taught to reject the divine within themselves began to reproduce this rejection in their children, their grandchildren, and their communities. The theology of fear became inheritance. The faith that was supposed to liberate became a prison. And to this day, we see churches packed with black bodies, unaware that they are worshiping a God born within their own ancestry, but who has been whitened, institutionalized, and presented as foreign. When a people forget who their God is, they forget who they are. They lose their direction, their strength, their identity, and most dangerous of all, they begin to live a borrowed spirituality, without roots, without sacred territory, without ancestry. A spirituality that doesn't heal, doesn't welcome, doesn't balance, it only controls. A spirituality that promises heaven, but delivers fear. But the cycle can be broken, because where there is memory, there is return. And today, that return is happening. There is an awakening happening everywhere. People are beginning to question, to investigate, to excavate the rubble of erasure, to reconstruct their spiritual histories, to name what was silenced, to say aloud what for centuries was only said in secret. If you feel this, if something inside you is telling you that this story is yours too, then I invite you to comment here. I am healing my faith, or my spirituality has African roots. Write with courage. Write with soul. Your comment is not just a text, it is an affirmation of existence. It is part of the collective healing. Even after centuries of persecution, censorship, distortion, and erasure, the presence of the African god did not disappear. He simply took on new forms. He hid in what seemed like folklore, in the dance that many called entertainment, in the names that survived in families, in the songs sung at night, in the rituals preserved in silence and faith. Because when a god is true, he does not depend on institutional recognition. He lives in the soul of the people. He pulsates in the hands of those who worship, in the feet of those who dance, in the voices of those who sing. This God remained alive because he was carried in the heart, even when he could no longer be freely proclaimed. In many places in Africa and the Americas, ancestral rituals never ceased to be practiced. Even when hidden from the watchful eye of colonial priests and masters, even when camouflaged under Christian imagery or European names, the fundamental elements of this God continued to be revered. Water, fire, earth, air, wind, thunder, rain, tree, ancestor, drum, silence. Each of these elements remained a channel of connection with the original sacred. And even though many no longer knew the ancient name, the gesture, the intention, the rhythm, everything continued to carry the essence of the original creator. The toreros of Brazil, the Vodun houses of Haiti, the Santeria rituals of Cuba, the Ifa cults of Nigeria, the Vodou practices of Benin, the chants of the Gula in the southern United States. All these are living testaments to the fact that African faith endured, that the God they tried to erase never ceased to be worshipped, loved, and respected. He simply came to live in codes, in symbols, in sounds that only those who were part of the people could decipher. It was like a secret language between the divine and the children of the earth. And even today, many practice it without knowing that they are connecting to the same God their ancestors knew long before colonization. In every drumbeat, there is a prayer. In every offering, there is a gesture of gratitude. In every leaf collected, there is a pact with sacred nature. In every African name rescued, there is a memory being restored. In every rite of passage, of birth, of death, of healing, of harvest, there is the silent presence of this God who never left. Because African spirituality is not based on the rigidity of temples, but on the fluidity of life. The temple is the body. The altar is nature. Liturgy is the movement of existence. The divine is where there is respect, rhythm, truth, and ancestry. This continuity is also revealed in the preserved names. Even when many were baptized with European names, African names remained alive behind the scenes. Some were given as nicknames. Others reappeared in subsequent generations, and each name carries with it a spiritual force, a destiny, a mission, a direct connection to divinity. Names like Ifa, Nzinga, Oba, Ayo, Yamanja, Zango, Okshum, Elegua, among many others, are not just names, they are presences. They are gateways to the divine. And it's important to understand that this African God is not stuck in the past. He is reinventing himself with each new generation that awakens. Young black men and women around the world are rediscovering their roots, studying their spiritual origins, and rebuilding their faith based on ancestral truth. Books are being written. Films are being produced. Music, art, performance, dance, fashion, everything is being used as a tool for reconnection. Because African spirituality is alive. It breathes. It moves. It evolves. The most powerful thing is to see that, even amid modern chaos, identity crises, and attempts at cultural homogenization, there is a growing movement to return to what was lost. And this return is not a denial of the Christian faith or other beliefs. It is a reconnection with one's roots. It is the breaking of shame. It is reconciliation with the sacred that was stolen. It is the recognition that before any imposition, there already was spirituality. There already was communion with the divine. There already was faith. Many say they no longer follow a religion, but they feel something greater, something profound, a force that calls them home. This force has a name. This force has rhythm. This force has color, memory, and song. It is the God who survived shipwreck, the stocks, the hold, catechism, slavery, and spiritual oppression. It is the God who lives between the lines of culture, in everyday gestures, in care for others, in respect for the earth, in the silence of the dawn. The most beautiful thing is that this God doesn't demand perfection. He doesn't demand guilt. He doesn't oppress. He doesn't segregate. He doesn't punish for existing. On the contrary, he embraces. He welcomes. He teaches by example, by intuition, by connection with the elements. And that's why he remains alive, because he lives in the small things, in the great forces, in the invisible that guides the visible. If you've made it this far in this video, it's because this God is calling you too. Maybe you feel it as a shiver, a memory, an emotion you can't even explain. Maybe it's the first time you've heard it so clearly. Maybe you've never identified with the religious discourses imposed on you. And now you're beginning to understand why. Because your faith isn't new. It was just dormant, and it's waking up now. So I want to invite you to write here in the comments, "This God lives in me," or "My ancestry is sacred." If you practice any Afro-Brazilian spirituality, or are in the process of returning, share your story. If you feel something has changed within you after hearing all this, share it. You are not alone. You are part of a reconnection movement that is growing every day. If, after everything we've seen so far, you still feel an uneasiness deep down in your chest, it's because we're reaching the most delicate, most provocative, and most liberating part of all. Because if the African God has remained alive through traditions, rituals, songs, and ancestral roots, there is still a deeper layer that many avoid touching: the surprising, albeit veiled, presence of African spirituality within Christianity itself. Yes, that's what we're talking about now. Because despite having been fought, burned, and condemned, the African faith has ended up being silently absorbed into the Christian faith. And this is where the paradoxes reveal themselves. Because while missionaries demonized the cults of Orishas, Voduns, and ancestors, they simultaneously imported and reinterpreted many of their symbols, concepts, and spiritual structures, but without acknowledging them, without giving due credit, without recognizing their roots. And the result was the creation of a Christianity that carries in its deepest form several traits of what was once ancestral African spirituality. Let's start with the angels. In many Afro-Brazilian traditions, the intermediary deities between the Creator and humanity were spiritual entities endowed with strength, intelligence, personality, energy, and purpose. They weren't independent gods. They were specific expressions of the whole. Sound familiar? In Christianity, we have angels and archangels with names, functions, powers, appearances, and even responsibilities over aspects of human life. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, each with their own energy, just like Zango, Ogum, Okshosi, Obaluaye, each with their own domain. But in official Christian discourse, this similarity is denied. Not for lack of spiritual coherence, but because to admit it would be to recognize the African spiritual matrix as a legitimate source of divine wisdom. And this would undo centuries of Eurocentric indoctrination. Another example is the form of worship. In many Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches, the presence of the Holy Spirit is invoked through shouting, dancing, speaking in tongues, trances, prophecy, the laying on of hands, collective ecstasy, and the use of natural elements such as olive oil, water, and salt. All of this was already practiced in African origin rituals before the arrival of Christianity on the continent. It was long condemned as Macumba, but today within churches, it is revered. The only difference is that it now has a different name, but the root, the vibration, the channel remain the same. And what's more, worship services with drums, repetitive chanting, raised hands, closed eyes, bodies in motion, none of this existed in traditional European Christianity. This came from the black body. It came from the African soul. It came from ancestry. It was black people who brought life, rhythm, warmth, and pulse to Christian worship. And yet they were taught to be ashamed of their own spiritual origins. Let's go even deeper. Many biblical characters revered in traditional Christianity carry traits reminiscent of archetypes of African deities. Moses, for example, represents the guide, the leader of the people, the one who opens paths. Just like Ogum, David, the warrior and singer, recalls Okshosi. Solomon, the king of wisdom and mysteries, echoes traits of Orunmila. John the Baptist, the prophet of the desert, connected with water and baptism, recalls Oxum or Nana. Mary, the divine mother, the intercessor, the welcomer, is not at all far from the image of Yemanja. And Jesus, the Son of Light, who heals, who teaches, who confronts the system, who dies and is reborn, he is not far from being seen as the supreme mirror of Elohim or Nzambi. None of this is by chance, because what we call archetype is the spiritual language of the human soul, and each people has found their own way to represent these forces. What Christianity has done over the centuries is absorb these archetypes, whiten them, Europeanize them, and mold them to its narrative. It has removed the African traits and replaced them with adapted versions. But the original vibration remains, and this is beginning to be perceived by more and more people. This is why so many Christians today find themselves in conflict, because they feel deep down that there is something incoherent between the discourse they have received and the energy they live. Many attend church, but their true connection is with nature, with the elements, with their intuitions, with their dreams. Many pray with their eyes closed, but it is by looking at the open sky, feeling the wind, listening to the sound of water that they truly experience God. And this is not a deviation. This is living ancestry. The truth is that part of Christian spirituality, especially in the African diaspora, was formed on a foundation that blends the Bible with the drum, the psalm with the axe, praise with African spiritual heritage. But all of this was shrouded in silence, shame, or denial. Therefore, many Black Christians still live divided today. They feel they have to choose between their faith and their origins, between the Bible and their ancestors, between Jesus and their orishas. But perhaps the path isn't to choose. Perhaps the path is to reconcile, to rediscover, to understand that everything is part of the same divine root. What is emerging now is a theology of healing, a spirituality of reconciliation, a faith that does not separate but unites, that does not impose but awakens, a faith that honors the gospel but recognizes that before it, God already spoke, and he spoke in Yoruba, in Bantu, in Fon, in Iwe, in silence, in drums, in cymbals, in dreams. This conversation may be uncomfortable for many, but it's necessary, because only when we recognize the true origin of our faith can we walk with freedom and truth. Only when we remove the mask of imposition can we look at God with our own eyes and understand that he was never as far away as they said. He always spoke our way. He was always by our side. We just wish you didn't know that. If this video is making sense to you, if something touched you deeply, if you feel like you need to think more about all this, then comment below, "I am reconciling my faith with my roots," or "Now I understand where my spirituality comes from." This comment will be a seed. It can help others free themselves from guilt, fear, and confusion. And if you'd like to share your experience with Christianity and ancestry, please write too. This space is safe, it's real, it's healing. If you've made it this far, it's because this message touched your soul in some way. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the end of this journey. It shows that you're searching for something deeper, more truthful, more connected to who you truly are. And that's exactly why this channel exists. So now I ask you for 3 simple but powerful things. First, subscribe to the channel now. Activate the bell. Because here, each video is a deeper dive into spirituality, ancestry, and hidden truths. And I want to walk this journey with you. Second, if you stuck around until the end, leave a like. It's not just a click. It's a signal to YouTube that this content matters, that it needs to reach more people who, like you, are awakening. And third, comment below, "I went all the way because this truth belongs to me." Write this phrase in the comments if you felt this video spoke directly to you. This phrase will show that you are among those who feel, awaken, and embrace their spiritual journey with courage. And before you leave, don't forget to watch the next video, which is already appearing here on the screen. It's a direct continuation of this conversation. Click now and follow me, because the call doesn't end here. It's just beginning. See you there. Axe.